Thank you very much for making that small adjustment. I would like to also, since the first time of my taking the floor, to observe slight protocol, which is to recognize the Field Admiral Awal Zubairu Gambo, CFR, the chairman of the African Economic Global Convergence, and the immediate past CNN Chief of Naval Staff of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and his wife. I think we must recognize that. And also, of course, my sister, Her Excellency Zainab Ahmed, CON, Executive Director, World Bank Group, and we served together, as she mentioned earlier, the late President Muhammad Buhari, she as the Minister of Finance, and myself, I think, as the Chief of Staff. Because sometimes I thought I was a man for all purposes in that administration. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank the organizers for inviting me to just say a few words before we go into the panel discussion, and to highlight the strategic investment for peace and economic opportunities pathway to SDGs acceleration in Africa. And I really want to begin by acknowledging the timeliness and the relevance to this particular theme by citing the most recent report by the United Nations Secretary General, recently published, titled "The Security We Need, Balancing Military Spending for a Sustainable and Peaceful Future." And in Chapter 6 of that report, he argued that there's no peace without sustainable development, and there'll be no sustainable development without peace. The linkage between peace and security on the one hand and sustainable development on the other. But he defined peace through a human-centered, multi-dimensional approach to security. Because in a real sense, you can have physical security of the state, but insecurity for the citizens of the state, of the countries. So we have to approach security as human security in all these dimensions: political security, economic security, social security, and even environmental security. In Chapter 7 of that report, which I consider very relevant, the Secretary General mentioned the need for urgent call for action which must resonate with us here. It is to build on the momentum generated by the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, in which it stated clearly the responsibility of countries, the responsibility of international financial institutions, and the responsibility of all of that, of all of us here. In this regard, they need to also reduce the cost of capital and to pursue concrete steps to address the debt crisis facing Africa and developing countries. Because the more we address that debt crisis and release Africans from spending so much of their budget on debt release, the more resources will be available for capital development, capital investment, which will then position Africa as a real partner with the international community and the international investment stakeholders to join together to take advantage of the enormous opportunities that Africa has. And Africa itself has taken the lead by organizing the very first debt conference in May this year. This is to recognize that beyond fiscal management, Africa is facing a really huge debt crisis. Let me just illustrate. And imagine the kind of resources that will be freed if Africa is not locked into having to pay a lot of make a lot of financial commitment to debt relief. African countries allocated, listen to the 163 billion to servicing debts in 2024, which is 335% increase from the 61 billion in 2010. Debt service now consumes 14.8% of the continent's export earning, and if you contrast that with only 4.5% in 2011. Which sector suffers the most when you have to use a lot of your annual budget and other resources for debt relief, public health, and also the commitment to the SDGs suffers and are undermined. Along with debt relief, there will need to be domestic resource mobilization. International development institutions, financial institutions must triple their lending capacity. Furthermore, the African Union's first debt conference earlier this year proposed concrete reforms to address this debt crisis, such as the Pan-African Credit Rating Agency. The Africans also, I'm happy to remind this audience, is really committed to silencing the guns in Africa, because they realize that while wars and conflicts continues, then scarce resources are then pushed into humanitarian relief and other things that divert attention from constructive endeavors. In fact, Africans need dividends of peace, and they're also committed to reform their organization, the Continental Organization, African Union, to meet the challenges of the time and to promote the kind of investment climate that will be conducive to the kind of investment that the continent did. As a matter of fact, in Luanda, Angola, later this year, November, there will be an extraordinary summit of the African Union members to address the issue of institutional reform, to address the issue of peace and security on the one hand, and creating a climate conducive for investment on the others. Meanwhile, there are a lot of deep holes, huge holes, of financial leakages, such as the illicit financial outflow from the continent, which will have to be plugged, illegal mining, which denies communities, countries, and the continents of resources that they can use to address some of the deficits in infrastructure and so on, and also illegal mining and export of enormous mineral and natural resources of our continent that have little value added by the time of their exportation. So this is the time for strategic investment for peace and economic opportunities that we need. And I look at my own country, Nigeria. By some UN estimate, Nigeria's population Nigeria will become the third most populous country in the world by the year 2050. It's already the most populous in Africa. And I think a situation like this, the third most populous, India will be first, China second, and then Nigeria. I think if I were a Nigerian politician, I would have sleepless nights on what to do about the third most populous country in the world by 2050. 2050 is not a long time. Recall that when we were talking of the year 2000, it looked like a long time to come, but now we are 25 years into this millennium, so we're talking of 2050. Where will the people live? Transportation. How will the children be educated? Health, housing. I mean, Nigerian politicians are having sleepless nights already, but sleepless nights about who is going to be elected president in 2027. They should be having sleepless nights. And this is where also these are opportunities for investment. Imagine housing, investment in housing, in education, in health, in transportation, in infrastructure, in power. So enormous in just one country in the continent. So the investments that are needed urgently in the infrastructures, our former Minister of Finance, I mentioned it, ports, development of ports, and other transportation needs to take advantage of the so-called blue economy, health, education, I've mentioned, natural resources, mineral resources, oil and gas, the usual suspects are also there. So what I want to do is just to end with a final statement before perhaps we go into the panel discussion, which is this. The international community, that is all the countries in the world, they'll be gathering, they're already gathering from today at the 80th anniversary of the birth of the United Nations. The private sector, in particular, civil society, NGOs, they have passed from the perspective of of the approach of what do we do for Africa now, you know, the time of aid handouts, moved into what do we do with Africa now for mutual benefits and common commitment to peace and security and sustainable development in the world. So I'm hoping that this, our discussion today will be followed with concrete action to really actualize this commitment, this common commitment for mutual benefits, but also common commitment for peace, without which there can be no development, and of course there will be no durable peace without sustainable development either. I thank you very much for listening.